Today we're digging into a nearly $5 million project, one that was supposed to solve a crisis for an unhoused community. It came with these huge promises of support, of safety, and a real path to permanent housing. But when you look at the documents, the grant applications, the financial records, the resident surveys, they tell a completely different story. So what really happened to that $4.8 million promise? This is where we have to start, with this voice. It's from a survey of the former residents, the very people this whole project was supposed to help. They were promised a fresh start, right? But when they were asked to rate their quality of life after it was all over, that was the feeling. This wasn't just a failure to help. For a lot of them, it actually made things worse. And this is where that disconnect just becomes so clear. I mean, the whole point was to be a bridge to stability. But for over 84% of the people they surveyed, it meant losing everything they had. Their vehicles, their tents, all their belongings. And that really brings us to the central question we're asking here. How did a project with millions of dollars, designed with dignity and wellness in mind, end up causing so much harm? To really understand what went so wrong, we have to rewind, go back to the very beginning, to the plan itself. Because this wasn't just some local idea, it was bankrolled by a massive state grant that came with some very, very specific rules. Here's the number that got the whole thing started. Just shy of $4.9 million. I mean, that's a huge investment. It was meant to turn this 2.6-acre encampment into a shining success story for the whole state. So yeah, the expectations were incredibly high. Now, here's a detail that is absolutely crucial. That grant money came with a non-negotiable condition. They had to use the Housing First model. And that's not just a suggestion, it's state law. The whole philosophy is simple. Remove the barriers. Things like sobriety or credit checks, get rid of them. The goal is to get people into housing right away, and then you offer support services. But you don't force them. You get people inside, period. And based on that philosophy, the city made some crystal clear promises in their grant application. I mean, they laid out these exact measurable goals. 70% into permanent housing, that's the big one, assess every single person for their needs, and finally, clean up the site and give it back to the community. This was their own official benchmark for success. So let's see how they did. You know, with any investigation, the first thing you do is follow the money. We've got the plan, we've got the promises, but the spending reports, they show us where the priorities really were. And right away, wow, we see a massive shift. The city planned on spending about $467,000 on security for the site. The final bill, over $1.1 million. That's more than double the original budget, just an enormous overspend. So you have to ask, where did all that extra money come from? Well, here's a big piece of the answer. The budget for basic on-site human needs, we're talking food, water, showers, trash pickup, even jobs for residents, it was slashed. They planned for $475,000. They only spent about $166,000. So while the security budget was exploding, the budget for basic human dignity was cut by nearly 2/3. Let's break down exactly how they covered that $651,000 security overage. The money was pulled from two main places. First, they saved over $400,000 on city staff and admin costs. And second, another $340,000 was taken directly from site operations and aid. You know, the services people were relying on every single day. The money was moved from people to patrols. But the security spending gets even more bizarre when you look at the timeline. The whole point was to move people out and close the encampment, right? Well, the security didn't stop when the people left. So let's just ask the question straight up. The project's own goal was to have everybody out by the end of June 2023. So how much did they spend on security guards after that date when there was literally no one left to guard? The number is it's staggering. Nearly $500,000. For almost a whole year, this project paid for security to guard a vacant, fenced-off lot. That's 44% of the entire security budget, spent after the people were already gone. And here is the real human cost of that choice. The original budget was set up to help about 122 people. In the end, they only served 90. The records show that $500,000 security overspend, the money for the empty lot, it was almost exactly what it would have cost to actually house the 32 people who were budgeted for but got left behind. Look, financial mismanagement on this scale, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. To understand how these decisions got made, we have to look at who was running the show and, maybe more importantly, who was getting paid. To get this, you have to look at the history. Federal documents show that one of the landlords who got housing funds from this project, a man named Kevin Hampton, had a long history with the city. And the key thing is, way back in 2014, a federal audit officially warned the city of Richmond that his company lacked capacity. But years later, here he was again. And let's be really clear about the language used here. This wasn't some minor issue. A federal audit by the Office of Inspector General concluded the city had failed to administer a previous grant, and they explicitly named Kevin Hampton's group as incapable. This was an official, on-the-record warning, 8 years before this new project even started. And this is where it all snaps together. The person hired to be the overall project manager, the one responsible for getting residents into housing, was Vanessa Calloway. One of the landlords who owned properties where those residents were placed was Kevin Hampton. And the smoking gun, right there in the California Secretary of State records, Kevin Hampton is the registered legal agent for Vanessa Calloway's own nonprofit. The project manager was steering funds to properties owned by her organization's legal representative. So with all of this financial chaos and these clear conflicts of interest in the background, let's circle back to where we started, the people. What was the actual final outcome for the residents of the Castro encampment? You know, the official report that went to the state, it paints a pretty rosy picture. Of the 90 people they served, it says 65 were placed in permanent housing. On paper, that's a 72% success rate, which just squeaks by their 70% goal. But permanent housing doesn't always mean safe housing. Because when you dig into the details, that number just collapses. Public records and source documents confirm that at least 24 of those successful placements were in buildings owned by these conflicted landlords that were later shut down by the fire department or deemed uninhabitable because they were so unsafe, and in those buildings, 3 people reportedly died. So the real number of safe, successful placements, it wasn't 65, it was 41 at best. And this really puts the cost into a brutal perspective. When you take the total $4.8 million grant and divide it by the 90 people they claim to have served, the cost comes out to over $54,000 per person. That is an incredible amount of money for a project where more than a third of the so-called successes were actually placements into dangerous, uninhabitable conditions. And if you need just one last perfect little example of this whole disconnect, the grant application actually promised to sustainably restore the site. They even budgeted money for landscaping. But the site itself is a paved concrete lot under a freeway overpass, and the financial records show that landscaping money wasn't spent on trees or plants. It was spent on industrial fencing and heavy concrete barriers to wall the whole area off. In the end, this project did achieve one goal. It cleared the land. But it leaves you with a really big question. When you fail the very people you were funded millions of dollars to protect, what does success even mean?